Good afternoon, everyone. Welcome to UNSW. Welcome to this launch of the Inequality in Australia report. I'm Eileen Baldry. I'm the Deputy Vice-Chancellor, Equity, Diversity and Inclusion at UNSW and a great supporter of this partnership. I would first like to acknowledge the Bedegal people, the traditional owners of this land, their elders past and present, and to acknowledge that this was and is and always will be Aboriginal land. And I welcome any Aboriginal people here today. UNSW is tackling inequality through many avenues. We have Professor Richard Holden. Put your hand up. Where are you, Richard? Professor Richard Holden, together with his co-chair, Professor Ros Dixon, are leading an inequality challenge, a grand challenge around inequality. So UNSW is seeing inequality as a major issue in Australia today. We have had speakers come to UNSW over this last year for that grand challenge. Later this year, the Grand Challenge will launch a report on social return accounting, a principled way for government to measure the return on social investments of all kind, ranging from physical infrastructure to social insurance schemes. By putting all government investments on a level playing field, it permits a clearer assessment of how to prioritise government investments. And reports such as this and those developed through this partnership, which I'll mention in a minute, are very important in influencing change towards addressing inequality and inequity in our society. So to the partnership today. UNSW Sydney and ACOSS formed a partnership almost a year ago now, not quite, specifically to work on inequality and poverty, and to give an excellent foundation for the reports that Professor Peter Saunders with ACOSS has been producing over the last couple of years, the last few years. This particular report highlights the stark disparity between high-income earners and those on the lowest incomes, as well as those of high wealth and those with the lowest wealth. But I will leave any further discussion of that to our speakers today. We are to deliver two reports this year, this one and one on poverty, and we will be doing that over the 5-year life of this partnership and hopefully into the future after that as well. I would particularly like to acknowledge partners who I hope are attending this event, who are partners with ACOSS and with UNSW in doing this. The Red Cross, Brotherhood of St Lawrence, Good Shepherd, Salvation Army, CoHealth, and I think Lynn Morgaine was at the launch earlier today, Mission Australia, the Smith family and Anglicare. So thank you to our partners, thank you to our Grand Challenge on Inequality for helping sponsor this as well, this event. And without further ado, I would like to introduce Professor Peter Saunders, the main author of the report, to speak to us for a little while about the nature of the report. Thank you, Peter.
Thank you, Eileen. I'm listed there as the academic lead. This is a team effort. My colleagues, Bruce Bradbury and Melissa Wong, one of whom was in America while he worked on it, and Melissa is in Perth while she worked on it, did most of the analysis, and Peter Davison and Jackie Phillips from ACOSS helped with the drafting and kept us on the straight and narrow. Very much a team effort. I'm going to, my brief really is to talk about some of the overall features of the report, which is available over there. There is a supplementary report which you can access through the ACOSS website, and eventually we'll be able to access from the SPRC website. And I won't talk about what's in the supplementary report, the details, although I suspect that in the panel discussion some of the panellists might well focus on some of those details. And I have to say the details are important. So what are we trying to do in producing these reports is to provide and produce an authoritative but hopefully non-technical account of what's happening to economic inequality in Australia. We're trying to combine technical sophistication with reporting accessibility. And that's meant that we presented some of the information in ways which might seem somewhat strange to those of you who are familiar with looking at studies of inequality. Studies of inequality tend to present information in terms of shares, what does the top group get compared to the bottom group, and so on, and the Gini coefficient, which, as you probably know, is a summary measure and varies between 0 and 1. More on that in a moment. Those figures are valuable and useful, but essentially are meaningless to most ordinary people. So in order to try and overcome that and produce some analysis that everyone can understand and benefit from, we've tended to present information for different income groups in terms of the average income for that group. And that means that most people know roughly what their own incomes are. They can look at our figures and get an idea of where they sit in the distribution. And I'd encourage you all afterwards to go away and do that. And you will be very surprised at where you fit. I once asked my colleagues at SPRC to estimate where they fitted in the distribution, and every one of them was out by a very, very long way. So that's the first point about presentation. The other thing to say is that we are trying to collect here and summarise a massive amount of information. Imagine this room. Imagine if we were to collect the incomes of everybody in this room and calculate the Gini coefficient. Well, we could do that, and I could tell you that the Gini coefficient is 0.37. It wouldn't mean much to any of you, but it would have been a tremendous amount of work gone into producing that figure. Okay? Now, we might be interested in what our colleagues all get in terms of our own income. I'm sure we'd be interested in that, although, of course, the data would be anonymised, so you wouldn't know. But when the data that we're using, produced by the ABS, the survey that they conducted, the latest one in 2016, covers 34,000 people living in 18,000 households across Australia. And the Gini coefficient collapses all of the information about all of those people into one number. Pretty impressive. When you weight the sample up so it reflects the full population, we're talking about a survey that covers 4.7 million people living in 2.4 million households. So when we split our sample up into quintiles, these are groups 1/5 of the population. The quintiles is a common way of summarising what's happening in inequality. Those quintiles each contain almost 500,000 households and containing 1 million people each. So, very big numbers summarised in a very small range of statistics, and that's one thing to bear in mind. The Gini coefficient, as you might know, varies between 0 and 1. It's a statistic. 0 means everyone has the same income. 1 means one person or one household has all the income and everyone else has none. But in reality, the Gini coefficients actually vary in a much smaller range. There are very few countries in the world that have a Gini coefficient below 0.2, and there are very few countries in the world that have a Gini coefficient above 0.5. So the actual variation in the Gini coefficient is between 0.2 and 0.5. And that means, if you think about it, that a very small movement in the Gini coefficient can represent a seismic shift in incomes and how they're distributed and lead to quite dramatic economic and social effects. So bear those things in mind when I try and summarise some of the main findings. I'll start with income inequality. So when we split the distribution into those shares, 5 shares. Each share contains 20% of the population, and we ask, what are the shares of incomes going to those different groups? The answer is that the top share gets just over 2/5 of the total, 39.8%, and the bottom quintile, the lowest quintile, gets 7.8%, a ratio of about 5 to 1. That's average across those two quintiles. As I said earlier, those quintiles contain 1 million people each, 5 million people each. If we move up the income scale, as you move higher up the income scale and you get smaller and smaller groups, the mean income of the group starts to rocket up towards the sky. So going up to and looking at the highest 10%, their average income is just under $5,000 a week. For the top 5%, the average income is over $6,000 a week. Compare that with the two corresponding groups at the bottom. The lowest 10% have an average weekly income of under $600 a week, and the lowest 5% have an average income of just over $400 a week. So one way of describing the inequality in income is to say that, on average, someone at the very top of the distribution, and here I'm talking about the top 1%, 47,000 people still, had a weekly income of $11,682 on average, those 47,000 people. And that's more than 26 times the average income of the 235,000 people in the lowest 5%. 26 to 1. That means that someone at the top 1%ers, are earning as much in a fortnight as the people in the bottom 5% are earning in a year. And that gives you a sense of the degree of inequality we're talking about in relation to income. Well, of course, just looking at what the level of income inequality is doesn't tell us anything about whether it's too high or too low or about right. And basically there are no clear-cut guides to answer that question of what is the ideal distribution of income, but we can look at comparisons, and the report does two kinds of comparisons. How do we compare with how we were in the past, and how do we compare with other countries now? So briefly on past trends, the report covers the period from 2000 to 2015, and we split that in 2008, which, as you remember, is when the global financial crisis hit. So we've got the pre-crisis period and the post-crisis period. And in relation to income, basically what's been happening is that in the pre-crisis period, income inequality has been edging up consistently. And since the crisis, it has moved up and down a bit from year to year, but doesn't show any clear trends. And we described that in the report as having plateaued. Plateaued at a high level. So the peak of inequality was in 2008, and we're still more or less there, slightly less now, but we've been moving up and down since. In terms of international comparisons, the latest OECD data, and that data uses the same data that we're using, the ABS data, shows that the Gini coefficient in Australia is about 6% higher than the average for all OECD countries, and we rank 26th out of 36 countries for which information is available. We sit within a group of countries that might surprise you. We have slightly more inequality than Japan, Estonia and Portugal, and slightly less inequality than Greece, Spain and Latvia. Not the sort of countries we normally compare ourselves with, but they are the countries that are closest to us in the OECD ranking. I did a similar ranking some years ago, and I wrote an article for the Australia Yearbook 2001, and our ranking there was pretty much the same as it is now. So we're still stuck just below halfway, between halfway, 2/3 down the league table of international rankings. Okay, a few comments on wealth inequality. The first point is that wealth inequality is much more unequally distributed than income inequality. The average wealth of the highest fifth of households is just under $3 million. It's almost 100 times that of the lowest fifth, which have average wealth of $30,000. $30,000. That's 4.7 million people on average only have $30,000 in all wealth. The average wealth holdings of the top 10% and 5% are 4.2 million and 6 million respectively. Wealth is distributed more equally when you rank households according to their income than if you rank households according to their wealth. So there are in Australia quite a large number of households who have relatively low income, so they're at the bottom of the income distribution, but they're further up the wealth ranking. Why is that? Well, that's because of home ownership. And home ownership has traditionally been a main pillar of the retirement income system and the general system of social protection in Australia. If you can encourage people into home ownership, their basic needs and many of their expenses are met, and they can live in a secure home of their own. I'm sure that panellists will take up some of these issues, including home ownership, about which there's some interesting findings, but I'll leave that to others to talk about. We don't have so much information on comparisons. The ABS has only been collecting the wealth data since 2003. But the story in wealth inequality over time is that it's been increasing, and it's been increasing both before the financial crisis and after the financial crisis. So the tendency for income to inequality to increase and then plateau is not the case for wealth. Wealth has carried on increasing. And over the period as a whole, the main beneficiaries have been the top quintile, the top fifth. Their share of total wealth has gone up by 3.2 percentage points, and all the other shares, all the other quintiles have experienced a decline in their relative share. The age profile of wealth has also shifted in favour of older groups. So if you look at how wealth has increased for different age groups, you find that the older the age group, the bigger the increase in average wealth, going back to 2004. And it's also the case that wealth inequality also varies systematically by age. So wealth inequality has grown fastest amongst the younger age groups than amongst the older age groups. This is linked to the housing issue I mentioned, and again I think will be something people will take up later. So that's the summary of the findings. I haven't mentioned at all public policy, but the impact of, if you read the report, you will see the impact of public policy permeates every single table in there. The setting of social benefits, the nature of the income tax system, the nature and coverage of tax concessions, the treatment of home ownership and investment in rental properties, market regulations, all of these affect all of the elements that go into those different components of income and wealth. And I'm sure some of these will be taken up later by the panellists. But the one point I want to emphasise here is that policy matters. These instruments can be varied by governments to impact on inequality. So from that point of view, the level of inequality that we have is our choice. We can either support the government or put pressure on the government to change, and we have the instruments that would allow us to change inequality. Just a couple of final observations. Australia in 2015 signed up to the Sustainable Development Goals. These go from 2015 through to 2030, and one of those goals is an inequality goal, and that inequality goal says that the income share of the bottom 40% of the population must increase the share between now and 2030. Over the last 15 years, that share actually did increase slightly from 20.7% to 21.1% in 2016. But it's actually fallen in the last 4 years. But we now have a clear inequality target that the government has signed up to. I'm not sure the government actually realises this yet, or all of them, but we do have a target, and Australia will be judged, and rightly so, by whether or not it achieves it. The Development Goal Target 4 requires all governments, and I just want to quote this, a small quote to finish. Requires all governments to adopt policies, especially fiscal, wage and social protection policies, and progressively achieve greater equality. I can't think of a better introduction than that to Cassandra, who I think is probably going to talk about some of those issues in what she's about to say. Thank you very much.
Thanks, Peter, and may I also acknowledge country and pay respects to the Aboriginal people, the traditional owners and custodians, and respect to elders, and to particularly acknowledge the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Islander leaders who are in the room today. It's great to have you here and your leadership ongoing. And a very, very warm welcome from me and all of my colleagues at ACOSS to all of you, this really important launch of what we believe is a very significant and really solid piece of work that should inform all of us in the community in the current environment where everybody is talking about what happened on a Super Saturday, and we're talking about the reality of what's happening in the community. Can I particularly warmly welcome those who have travelled and those who have been sick, because I think that's been a bit of a theme. There's been quite a few people with bugs, can I just acknowledge that? And particularly acknowledge the people who are present today who directly understand the challenges that are faced when you're on very low incomes, when you can't get paid work, and when you are unable to secure decent housing. Certainly the very idea of being able to own your own home is a far distant fantasy, let alone, and even a public policy possibility for you. So I just really do want to acknowledge people in the room who have that story. We've had a lot of media interest in this report over the last 24 hours, and there's been a number of people directly affected who have participated in telling your story about what's going on, and that's been incredibly important, so thank you. You've heard from my now dear colleague, Professor Peter Saunders, who's co-director of this partnership. We are not only still talking to each other, but we have continued to really enjoy working together. Peter has been really crucial in making this work happen, and he's done the Cook's tour through the findings. And there is a lot in this report. I mean, try and give a news grab in 30 seconds or less about what's in this report, and it is a bit of a challenge, but I do want to enable us to see some of the significance of this, because I know all of you in your own way are advocates in the community, and being able to deal with the facts is very important, and that is what we are committed to doing. This is not about political rhetoric. This is about making sure that we're across the evidence and having a deep understanding of the trends in our community. So it is absolutely a fact that Australia is and remains one of the wealthiest countries in the world. It is also absolutely a fact that we have almost uniquely enjoyed over 2 decades of sustained economic growth. Yet, as this report confirms, over that same period we have allowed, and it is a choice, Peter, to the economic divides in our community to grow, both in terms of the income that we receive and the wealth that we are able to accumulate behind us. And of course, these two realities, the income that you get and what you can save, are directly linked. Everybody understands that. So Peter has given you that story about what happened pre the GFC in terms of income inequality, and we must not lose sight of that. That we allowed during that boom era a significant disparity to grow between people on very low incomes and people who did extraordinarily well out of that boom era. And there were policy choices that were made during that era, a raft of personal income tax cuts that were delivered, very generous tax concessions associated with the treatment of investment income, and that is what we saw happen to get us to the point where we are above the OECD average when it comes to income inequality. Now, the global financial crisis did hit, and it is a mixed story about what's happened since that point in time. But it's not a picture to celebrate. Look, we did have some important policies adopted post the GFC which helped to ameliorate the worst of income inequality, and I want to really acknowledge the government that introduced a significant increase to the age pension. That was the Gillard government that said, we will take this seriously, and they gave a $32 increase to the age pension at that time. What they didn't do was deal with the grossly inadequate level of the unemployment payment. And that will be a continuing message we will deliver out of this report, that it's one of the most essential changes that must happen to lift up the incomes of people in that bottom 40% of the community, actually, who at some point in time are relying on our social security system. What that period shows us is that those kinds of policies do change the picture when it comes to income inequality. And frankly, I don't think we need to talk about why that's the case in this room. It does seem to be that the politicians find it hard to understand that money matters. But the other part of the picture, of course, is the wage stagnation that has occurred post the global financial crisis. And Richard and I were talking earlier on. We are continuing to try and understand what is going on around wage stagnation, both globally and within the Australian community. I reiterate what Peter Saunders has highlighted, that our top priority has to be to lift up the incomes of people in the bottom 40% of the community. Not only is it a goal of the Sustainable Development Goal agenda, it is something that we have, rest assured, colleagues at UNSW reminded the government repeatedly that it is an obligation for us to deal with the inadequate incomes of people in the bottom 40% of the community. But we must understand what it means to lift up the bargaining power of people who are in low-paid work, and we must listen to the experience from our union colleagues about that and take this agenda very, very seriously, and at the same time continue to advocate for the increase to the level of the unemployment payment and understanding that social security really, really matters. What also the story on income inequality kind of masks, but many of our colleagues in this room who work in the community, understanding what people are going without, will know that post the GFC, whilst we might not have had the big swings in terms of income disparity, in other words, it didn't get a whole lot worse on the income front. What did get a lot worse was, of course, the prices of essentials of life. The cost of housing, the cost of energy has significantly increased, well and above the trend in terms of the what's happened to social security payments and low-paid wages. So that is why, when I was asked today by some of the journalists, well, you know, look, you've been talking about social security, you've been talking about those issues for what they said, it was 10 years, it's probably right in my case, longer for some of our colleagues at ACOSS. Why is the government not listening? And I said, well, the community is listening. The community knows this. This is what they are trying to get through to the government of the day, to understand that this is the lived experience of not just a tiny proportion of the community, but a significant proportion of the community, that your incomes are not enough to cover the basic costs that you need in order to live with a level of dignity. And of course that directly then ties into our picture around wealth, right? Because you are in the jargon dissaving. Many, many people now do not have enough income to put aside money saving for the rainy day, to provide you with even the basic sense of comfort around having a bit behind you in case, you know, something bad happens to you. But certainly that notion of being able to get behind you a deposit really does seem to have become a fantasy for far too many people. And as Katie Atchison wrote to us this morning as she was preparing to come onto the panel, I want to acknowledge the number of fantastic people that we'll have joining us on the panel. Emma as well, thank you so much for being here this afternoon as we dig into what more this data means to us. As Katie said, the report shows what young people have been telling us for years. They feel like they can't get ahead, that the world seems different for them than other generations, and that owning a home is completely out of reach. And I said to the journalists, and I think this is really important for us all to say, that this is not about us going into a war that's about, you know, young against old. In fact, many of the people that we talk to about this reality are older people who are deeply worried about what is going on for the younger generations in the Australian community. And that's why when the federal government passed over $144 billion in personal income tax cuts in the last federal budget in Parliament, we were flooded with people from the community saying, keep my $10, make sure that young people can buy a home. Keep my $10. Make sure that people can get enough to lift up the level of the unemployment payment. And so this is resonating in the community, that people are not championing tax cuts because they can see the reality for far too many people in the Australian community in terms of what needs to be done. And the policy solutions are there. Okay, so I've mentioned New Start. We've got to make sure that we are really working in a flexible way with younger people and other people who have locked out of the labour market. The demonising and nastiness that successive governments have tried to use to create this notion that if you're unemployed, it's your fault. Well, the community doesn't buy it, young people don't buy it, and their parents don't buy it either. And we need to back off from the nasty punitive policies of cutting people off on their income support and saying it's your fault if you can't get a job. Well, the young people of today know that that's not the reality, and we need to get behind people who are in this kind of situation to say we're there to support you and we'll provide you with flexible, good support. We're working on that, and we need people in the community to speak up on behalf of people who can't get enough paid work to live with dignity. The housing picture is something I'm hoping we'll spend some more time on the panel getting into the detail of that. I just want to give again another pitch around our position on tax. This isn't again about saying people are envious if you do well. This isn't about, so-called class warfare that we're looking to launch here. These are just facts. And being able to understand people who are wealthier in the Australian community, why we're making the case for contributing more to the tax base is for the right reasons. And it's actually about the benefit for us as a community. Because at the end of the day, inequality is a big discussion globally because it really matters. And it's a big discussion in the Australian community now. It matters socially. The way that you feel excluded, the shame that can be associated when you are so different to others that when you look around in the community, the shame of not being able to participate in the way that others can. It's bad economically. The IMF and the OECD are saying that we have to, in terms of the future of economic growth, it will not be a trickle-down approach. It will be by investing in the incomes and the living standards of people in the bottom 40% of the community. That is the IMF telling us that. And it matters environmentally. I mean, we have a massive drought going on. We have extreme weather events going on right now. We have climate change happening. It is the other global challenge. And what we all know is that those who are most vulnerable, that have the least behind you, are the most at risk in order to be able to adapt and deal with these kinds of major changes. And so it matters on that front. And frankly, it matters politically. I think we'll see some effort in, if I talk to a moment to elections, no doubt we'll have arguments about whether inequality is a problem or not. But what we see is that when we have these big disparities growing in the community in terms of the wealth and that sense of being severely disadvantaged, the power dynamics in the community are out of whack in terms of us fostering a really healthy democracy. And so I'm delighted to have been part of this initiative, and it has been a genuine collaboration. I really do want to do a few thank yous before we get into the panel stuff, because the production of this report has been only made possible by a lot of hard work. Again, Peter Saunders, thank you, and to Bruce Bradbury and Melissa Wong from the Social Policy Research Centre. It is complex, tricky work. I really want to acknowledge our colleague Peter Davidson. Where are you, Peter? Who was the principal drafter of this report, who produced this report in a phenomenal period of time, frankly, with a lot of data to grapple with. And so thank you and congratulations to you, Peter, for such a high quality report, contributed to by Peter Saunders and Jackie Phillips. In addition to the partners that Eileen mentioned, and many of you are represented here today, our ACOSS member friends, it's great to have you all here. Can I acknowledge also some private philanthropists who also see the value of this work to the Australian community? Anne Miller, we love you, Anne, thank you, and David Morowitz, who has been with us on this journey since 2012. Can I acknowledge the leadership of UNSW? Ian Jacobs, I know, is an apology today. Thank you, Eileen. It's been a plot for some time. We are up and running. with this work. It really is important, and I hope that it's a great resource for all of you. Look, you'll see the photographs on this report. I did just want to say thank you. Is anybody from Kingsford Legal Centre here? These photographs were a part of a project with UNSW Kingsford Legal Centre. It was a competition photographs. It is a public housing estate just down past Maroubra. In case you thought, oh, I've seen that place, that's where that's from. Thank you to our communications people, 50 Acres, and Joanna and your colleagues at UNSW. We've had a lot of media interest. We wasn't necessarily planned, but we've also had a big report come out from Hilda today. Roger Wilkins was an apology today because he's off also doing that report. We have a lot of rich knowledge before us now as a community to discuss these issues with, and let's get stuck into the panel. Thank you very much.
You're going to do it.
No. I'm sorry, Eileen. There's something really important. Jackie Phillips is really going to laugh at me because I'm notorious for doing this, which is forgetting to thank ourselves. And I did. I just did it again. So I want to finally and importantly and slowly give a huge thank you to my colleagues at the ACOSS team for the commitment that they have made to this. It truly has been a team effort, but may I particularly acknowledge, where is Jackie Phillips? Jackie Phillips, who has led the work at ACOSS, the lived experience of a massive production. You've done a fantastic job. And Penny Dorsch, where are you, Penny? There she is, who has been up very late nights, long weekends, a lot of detail, awful lot of footnotes. Brendan, you're beside her too, you know, and so thank you to the ACOSS team. Really couldn't have done it without you. Thanks.
Well, thank you so much, Cassandra. So now we're going to go into the rest of our time together with the panel. So I'm going to invite each of the panel members to come up and just sit anywhere along the front here. Emma Dawson, Executive Director Per Capita. Professor Peter Whiteford, Crawford School of Public Policy, Australian National University. Katie Atchison, CEO Youth Action. Ryan van der Newlen, Research Associate, City Futures, UNSW. And Dr. Julie Connolly, Deputy General Manager, Research and Policy Centre, Brotherhood of St Lawrence. So we will spend the next maybe 20 minutes with each of our panellists having a chance to say what's the burning issue for them, what do they see in the report. Then we will open it up for discussion, questions and comment. So, off we go. So we might... Ooh. Sorry. Great. Emma, we might start with you. Would you like to just say a few words about how you see this report and key aspects?
Thank you. Well, it's an invaluable piece of research, is the first thing to say. It's very rich in data, and Peter, I really do congratulate you on putting it together in what I understand was a very short period of time. It gives us a really quantifiable evidence about the nature of inequality, both in terms of income and wealth, and how it's developed over the last 15 or so years in Australia. And as coming from a public policy think tank, the focus for me is on how useful something like this is in advocating for policy change. And as Cassandra and Peter both mentioned, the role of policy, of public policy, in driving inequality and fostering solutions to inequality is critical. So when we think about the policies that have affected the findings in this report, as Cassandra mentioned, there were a large series of income tax cuts during the mining boom here that saw a lot of national prosperity, shared wealth, common wealth, funneled to a particular group of people who are already asset rich and income rich, and that certainly exacerbated inequality. We've seen other measures Cassandra referred to the lift in the age pension, but there are many other areas that still need a great deal of attention. And the thing about a report like this is it enables us to actually look at the data and say, if we intervened here, this is what the expected outcome could be. And that kind of quantifiable evidence is really important in advocating for policy change. It marries up with some of the work we did recently at Per Capita that looked at the share of the revenue foregone to the federal budget through income tax concessions for the highest quintile of income earners in the country. And we measured that using a methodology that the government themselves had used to assess the cost of welfare. You may remember in early January when we were all in that sleepy week between Christmas and New Year, there were breathless reports in the media that every taxpayer was paying $83 a week to support someone on welfare. So we decided to flip that around and had a look at what the average taxpayer was paying out of their pocket per week to support one of the top 20% of income earners, and found that it was $37 a week. So the amount of revenue foregone to the federal budget from these tax concessions, things like superannuation tax concessions, negative gearing, capital gains tax concession, is a use of family trusts to disperse income. We quantified it around $68 billion a year. Now, not all of that is money that could easily be recouped. Some, for example, includes the value of the family home and the exemption from capital gains tax on the family home. So you wouldn't want to cut that out completely. But there is a lot of room there. There's a lot of money there that could be clawed back to the budget to pay for services. And we made the point of comparing that to the annual cost of New Start, which is $11 billion a year. So we're talking about more than 6 times as much in foregone revenue going to people that are already very comfortable. So these are conscious policy choices that are being made. And while we have seen some debate in the political sphere, certainly the opposition has some policies looking at closing some of those tax concessions. We actually see government policies going in the opposite direction, where they're actually looking to flatten the progressive taxation system and put a cap on government spending in relation to GDP at 23.9%, which is completely arbitrary. And this will have the very real measure of reducing the amount of government revenue that can be spent on services, on welfare, on health and education in future. And so the concern for me is certainly both sides of politics over the last 30 years or so have had a bit of a fetish for reducing the size of government and reducing the role of the state and privatising things, and all in the name of cutting bureaucracy. And that's actually code for saying we want a less redistributive policy approach in the country, and that will only make inequality worse. And I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. Thank you. And Peter, your first blush thoughts.
I think if you haven't read this report already, you've got there's an enormous amount of information that's very concisely summarised here, and it's an excellent summary of sort of the state of the art about what we know about income and wealth inequality in Australia. I want to make 3 main points. As Peter referred to in his opening remarks, we often talk about inequality as if it's one thing, as if it's because we often measure it in terms of a Gini coefficient, which is one number, whereas in reality, of course, inequality is a very complex set of factors that operate in different ways in different periods and can offset each other at different times. And so what I'm thinking about in the sense is what I'd like to see in the next 4 reports or so over time. I mean, we're not going to get necessarily updated income surveys for about another 18 months or so. So there'll be opportunities for being more creative rather than just summarising what happens next, because next year we won't know what happens next. So what I think is really important is this disaggregated approach, to look at all of the components of what's going on. And that's what's happening in the labour market, what's happening to wages, the distribution of wages, what's happening to part-time work, what's happening to unemployment and underemployment, what's happening to investment income, and what's happening in the tax and social security system, and also what's happening in families. So there's an enormous number of things that go into producing one summary statistic. Having said that, as the report also points out, about 3/4 of all income of Australians comes from wages and salaries. So wages, the distribution of wages and salaries, and that includes the people who don't have wages and salaries, the zeros, in that particular calculation, is one of the most important policy areas. And I think this is where there's a lot of concern about inequality trends. I mean, there's quite a lot of debate about what's happening to inequality, but I think sort of it's pretty clear that over the last 4 or 5 years, real wages haven't increased at all, or very little, even for high income earners, and that comes out in the report. My understanding is that the reasons for that are not really well understood. That people don't quite, and this comes down even to the Treasury in terms of its sort of budget modelling and projections of what's going to happen over the next few years in the budget. They keep getting it wrong. So there's a lot of uncertainty about that. There's a lot of concern about underemployment. The Hilda report that came out today says that the gig economy isn't growing much, but I think that what the issue is there is about employment protection and employment regulation, and it's not so much the growth of jobs, it's actually businesses deciding to treat their workers very poorly. So I think that looking at what happens in the labour market, defined broadly to include people who don't currently have earnings, is very important. The third issue, which reflects the background that Peter Saunders and I and various other people in this room have, is looking at the role of the tax and social security system in terms of addressing some of these inequalities. And Emma's just pointed to the role of the tax system. And I just reinforce the idea that you can set the tax to GDP ratio so that it never goes above 23.9% of GDP, which is what the government has said is its aim. The government doesn't seem to understand how averages work, right? If you set the maximum at the long-term average, that means you're reducing it in the future, because you're not allowed, if you're never allowed to go over the previous average, you're going to be reducing the tax to GDP ratio, not keeping it constant. Now, the idea that we can keep the tax to GDP ratio constant for the next 10 or 20 years, when the population is ageing, when we want to spend more on healthcare, we want to spend more on education, and we have, for people of working age, an increasingly completely inadequate social security system, I think is just the wrong way of thinking about it. The other thing that comes out in the report, as it does from research in the Melbourne Institute, for example, is that over the last, well, it depends, maybe the last 20 years, the Australian social security system has become less effective at reducing inequality. Partly that's a good thing, because people have got jobs, so they need more people have got jobs, so they need social security less. But New Start is just inexorably falling behind community standards. We haven't yet really seen the impact of a lot of the changes in family payments that governments have done over the last few years. Both the Labor government and the current government. But our family payment system is shrinking. I mean, literally, we're now basically only providing family tax benefits to about the bottom 60% of the population, whereas up until 1987 we were providing it to 100% of families with children, and then over 80% for the next 20 years. Our family payment system is shrinking. The payments are only indexed to prices. We're creating in the family payment system exactly the same problem that we've got in relation to New Start. So if these policies continue without change, we're going to see increasing impoverishment of low-income Australians.
Thank you, Peter. We might now hear from Katie, perhaps particularly around young people, but whatever you want to comment on.
I have a lot to say about a lot of things.
I'm sure you do.
But let me just focus on young people. I think I really welcome this report, and I'm grateful for ACOSS and UNSW for taking the time to do this, because I think what the report does that is unique to other things that we've had before is that it does look at either the extremes, which maybe is a criticism, but I think is a strength, as far as particularly because obviously what is really clear from the report and what is being clear for many years for young Australians is that young Australians are being locked out of the job market, they're locked out of the housing market, they're experiencing very different living standards than their parents did, and they're not really sure exactly why. And what this does is show us that because there is inequality that is a stark reality for young people. I think it's particularly interesting. I just got back from India talking about the SDGs globally and talking about how young people are a very important power in making that happen. And I was working with countries that are what we would call developing nations, and they are obsessed as governments with how to involve young people. How do we get more young people into work? How do we make sure that they're safe, that they've got the education that they need to progress the countries? And yet in Australia, I stood on that stage as an expert saying we are doing the absolute opposite. We are de-investing in young people, we are increasing the inequality in their lives, and we are giving them the inheritance of a debt. And I say we because I am not a young person, and I am a voter, and these are policies. So we have made choices as a country to exclude certain people. And I think it's the harsh reality that sometimes we need to realise is that what is the cost of us having a tax system that benefits particular groups is that other people may inevitably be negatively affected. And if we look at the statistics for young people in Australia, it is very clear that they are having a negative effect on young people. So we have double the youth unemployment rate than the general population. It's gone down a tiny bit recently, which everybody was really excited about, but that means that they've had 1 hour of employment in a week, which doesn't mean that they have full-time or permanent jobs or safe jobs. We also see the underemployment is rising. The gig economy isn't as strong as we thought it was going to be. It hasn't produced things. And youth buying or young people buying homes is almost at record low levels of all time at like 2%, and depending what you're looking at and who it is, but for under 24-year-olds, around about 2%. So young people, when they say, I don't think I can ever buy a house, is because they can't. They are being locked out of the market. Why has this happened? Because we have a tax system that has preferred particular groups and was put in at a time that made sense and now doesn't. And so I'm not normally this direct, but I think this report deserves it. And I think we need to look at ourselves and say, what is happening for young people in Australia? What is the inequality, the cost of inequality for young people? But it's not just the difference between all of us experiencing inequality, and it's that this report shows that it doesn't look like it is going to be continuing to reduce unless we make some changes. And I think I bear this as a warning for all of us, is that if we don't say that we need to have a more equal society, then it will not change. But we are giving a generation lower living standards than we had, and we're also letting them inherit the debt that we are creating right now. So not only is it not better for them now, but it's going to be worse for them in their future. And what about their children and their children's children? So we have to take responsibility as an ageing population as to what is the cost of our wealth. And I think this report for me was a stark reality. And normally I'm much more general about this sort of thing, but I feel really personally convicted about the policies that are in place and what my part in that has been. And I think it's really important for us to have a really frank discussion as an Australian nation of saying, where do we want a future of our country to be? And do we want to be a country that is aiming towards inequality levels of UK and the United States particularly? Those two are scary goals for us to attain. And yet if we don't do anything about the systems that we have, if wealth is being contained in superannuation and housing, then young people are locked out because superannuation is based on a system that young people aren't living in. They don't have full-time jobs. It doesn't work like that. We have to change these systems. And when we have a social security rate, when we look at Newstart not having increased in 24 years, 24 years, there has been a massive living cost increase in that time. And so the Raise the Rate campaign, this isn't a leftist or rightist thing. This is about the future of our country. Do people have what it needs to be able to live with dignity in our country when we are rich? The answer is no. For people who are on Newstart, they cannot afford to live. They are going without food. They are going without the ability to get on a bus to get to a job. So I think I'm passionate about this because I sat in a room with people in countries that had so much less than us and were so much more invested in the future of their country, particularly through their youth. And I think we can do better. Australia has a long history of doing right by its citizens. Why should we stop now? We can change this and turn around, and we can reduce the inequality rates. Having it be plateau is not good enough. We need to see decreasing inequality in Australia and not be okay with the middle. Because if we leave it at the middle, young people are inheriting our debt, and it's just going to get worse and worse for them. Thank you.
Thank you, Kate.
Sorry, I'm a little bit passionate today. I'll dial it back.
No, don't.
Ryan, so I know you might particularly focus on housing and built environments, so to speak, but feel free to comment on any of the things that others have said.
Well, I mean, it's interesting. Housing sort of pops up in the background like the sort of daggy dad in your 21st photos. But it's interesting. It is sort of there in every aspect of some of these discussions. So, I am a planning and housing researcher, and so, my main takeaway from this, incredibly rigorous report, so congratulations to the team. But my main takeaway was this sort of little sub-story about housing wealth inequality and how that parallels with overall wealth inequality. And as the report shows, about half of Australia's wealth is in real estate. So it's not an insignificant part of that story. There's sort of three groups that are sort of we're thinking about when we think about housing wealth accumulation through growing house prices. The first is perhaps the most evident. That's people that don't own their own homes. And we know at the moment that the main barrier to home ownership, because we have low interest rates, is a deposit rather than servicing the mortgage. And what that means is that increasingly, as we sort of, if that trajectory continues, whether you own your own home is going to become a function of your wealth, not your income. And as Peter's pointed to, wealth inequality is much starker than income inequality, and it's continued to grow when income inequality has plateaued a little bit. And there are some generational aspects, and I think this report does a good job, and you've also pointed to this, Katie, is that we've really sort of got to push back against some of this rhetoric that generation rent is some benign lifestyle choice. I think people need to recognise that job insecurity, and having kids later are not, a cause of delayed home ownership, but delayed home ownership is a cause of some of these other things as well. So it's important to understand that, and I think this report does a good job of pushing back against that. But then it's, the other thing to point out is that it's not just young people whose home ownership rates are dropping. We're seeing home ownership rates drop across the board, and Peter sort of alluded to the fact that this means we've got more people reaching retirement with ongoing housing costs, and our welfare system's not really set up to handle that. And so there are implications for home ownership continuing to be a barrier for more Australians. The second group is perhaps at the other end of the spectrum, and that's those that own the houses that first group are renting, people that have investment properties. And again, the report showed that this is perhaps, it was, I think, amongst all the asset classes, the most unequally distributed. I think of about 4/5 of investment housing wealth was owned by 1/5 of the population. So that's quite stark, despite some rhetoric that we're all mum and pop investors. Now, economically, I can give you a bunch of reasons why that's a really unproductive, place for people to park their investments, and why the government should be using its tax levers to discourage that sort of investment. But I think there's a social imperative that's perhaps more appropriate for this audience, and that's the fact that we've got this disconnect between how landlords are making their wealth, which is just through a growing asset value, and rather than through providing a service that's needed of a housing product at a price point of a particular size in a particular location. So we know that there's terrible rental stress, and we know that there's terrible overcrowding, and that's because the incentives are not there to provide the product that there's demand for, or the product is you're investing because you've got this capital growth. So I think that's important to understand. Effectively what we've got really is, because of this, a private rental sector that's just not fit for purpose, and I think that needs to be understood. But the third group, and they're the sort of two extremes, but the third group sort of sitting in the middle is homeowners, and it's already been alluded to the fact that home ownership, this sort of, I guess, perception that if you're a homeowner, you're part of the rising tide as house prices go up. But I think that sort of needs to be challenged a little bit, perhaps for some of the sort of political discussions around whether growing house prices are a good thing. First of all, not all house prices are growing equally. There's a lot of regional areas and even parts of our metros that have not seen house prices grow as well. And so what that means is people who own a home there are seeing the gap between their wealth and a home that's in perhaps somewhere that's got better job opportunities is growing. So they're being locked out of job opportunities and prospects of increasing their own income and therefore their own well-being. But even if you sort of take the geography out of it and the differential in growing house prices out of it, if I own a small apartment and it goes up by 20% in value, if I've got 2 kids, the family home that I want to buy has also gone up by 20% in value. That means the gap that I've got to save, not through my housing wealth, has also gone up by 20%. So I'm actually in a worse off position if housing prices are going up. So it's important to understand that, again, suddenly we've got this position where the function of me being able to improve my well-being is a function of my existing wealth rather than a function of some of the other opportunities of income. So I think it's worth challenging across the board the fact that growing housing wealth has been a good thing, and I think this report goes some way to show that inequality is quite a problem. So again, thanks to the team.
Thank you, Ryan. So Julie, last comments of the panel in regard to the report, and I guess particularly from the Brotherhood's perspective of what you see on the ground and with people you work directly with every day.
Sure, absolutely. So thank you for the opportunity to be here. It's a fantastic report for those of you who haven't read it already. There are 2 things that were really struck me about the report when I read it. And one was about the relationship between employment and both wealth and income. Again, it's not hugely surprising, but there's a distributional anomaly across the Australian population. And at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence, we think of employment as an issue of justice. So it's not just about a market distribution of opportunity, it's an issue of justice. And there are people who are locked out of the labour market. They include a lot of young people, actually. And this is, again, something that we can make a policy choice about that can have a really meaningful impact on people's well-being in the short term. The second thing that I was struck, and I found the page that it was on, at the bottom of page 40, one of the comments is that the underlying trends that have been discovered in this analysis are only likely to be exacerbated if economic growth starts to accelerate again. That's a really important and I think scary finding, which speaks specifically to some of the debates in the Australian polity at the moment that I won't go into in any great detail right now. But what it means at the Brotherhood of St Lawrence is, in this context, how do we think about not only changing those macro policy settings that have produced the situation of inequality with which we find ourselves right now, but how do we ensure that we create the opportunity structure that enables people to move out of poverty? Because what we see on a daily basis is the incredible corrosiveness of living in poverty. And so that is not always well represented in a single statistic, as the point was made earlier. Even if you look at the stat, I think it's the lowest 5% have maybe $400 a week on average. If you're actually living in that 5%, you don't get $500 every week. It's actually incredibly variable. So living with an income which goes from actually $1,000 one week to $200 to another when you have children is extraordinarily difficult. It leads to the experience of shame and social exclusion. It leads to a sense of not being in control of your life. It leads to a really undermining dignity, the capacity that we should all have to be free in a wealthy nation. So from the perspective of the BSL, this is extraordinarily important research. I'm looking forward to the greater discussion, but perhaps also because I'm a political philosopher rather than an economist, I respond more heartily to words like justice and freedom, and I think we should make sure that they're part of our lexicon when we discuss things like inequality.
Fantastic. Thank you so much, all of you. Just a couple of comments, and then we'll open up for discussion and questions. One comment is, and I think I'm correct, am I not, Cassandra and Peter, that that the partnership is going to begin to produce some specific reports around specific areas like housing and employment and so on. So they will begin to come out of the work that we're doing together. Secondly, the thing that struck me absolutely overwhelmingly about everyone said was the absolute and foundational importance of policy settings. And it's what Cassandra said at the beginning, it's what Peter said, it's what every one of our panellists has said, that what we are seeing here is the result of deliberate policy decisions and deliberate directions that governments have and haven't taken. So I'd love to open it up for discussion. I think we have some mics around. Yes, so we have mics there. So, questions? There's one there. Thank you. And please say your name and your question. Not on, I think.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, that's good.
My name is Raja Janankar. I'm from the Industrial Relations Research Centre. Thank you for the report. It's very interesting. I haven't had time to read it, but it's making important points. I think one of the problems, I think, was mentioned by Cassandra was New Start allowance has been frozen for such a long time, and even the Labour Party, and even Bill Shorten, when he's asked today, we're going to review it at some time. He still is not willing to say we'll increase it. I think that's crazy. The other problem is public housing is sold off, and people then get shunted from the city area to Timbuktu or somewhere. I think that causes problems for a lot of poor people in terms of housing. The third issue is much more general, I think, which is worth mentioning. I think, I'm an economist, by the way, but economists seem to say that poor people have to be paid less, so they'll work harder, but rich people have to be paid more, lower the tax rates, so they'll work harder. So this is a nice sort of story to tell to persuade them to follow the policies, which, as it happens, almost both governments seem to do, which is rather sad. So I think the major problem isn't simply saying we should cut inequality, but the question is, how are we going to persuade both the government and the opposition that some of the economics which lies behind their policies is what is politely called neoliberal economics, but otherwise is I think, confused economics. Thank you.
Thank you. Maybe anyone might like to, everyone can comment on that.
There's an interesting bill that's going before Parliament or the Electoral Commission at the moment to lower the voting age to 16. And that means that 16 and 17-year-olds would get the vote. But the interesting thing is that would add 600,000 more voters, possibly, including the ones who are over 18 between 25. So we're talking about the youth vote. And young people vote on policy, like on politics and issues, not on along with political lines, which would be really, I think, great for Australia. Because some of we're going to look at it, we're not, the inaction of the governments, and both sides. I don't think this is a left and right. I think we can stop having the conversation about leftist and rightist things when it comes to this, because this inequality has been increasing over both sides. So this isn't a Liberal or a Labor issue, this is an everybody issue. Young people do see very clearly the inequality in Australia, and they think it's unfair for everybody, not just themselves. They're worried about older people, they're worried about everybody. And so changing it in the voting space would be really interesting, I think, because this is about voting, and the government does care about the things that voters care about. And there is an election coming up, and if inequality was an election piece, and there were more people in Australia who cared about inequality, what an interesting political debate we might have about how are we going to address this. Because at some point, we all have to bear the cost of saying, to change the country, we're going to have to, some of us are going to lose a little bit, and some of us are going to gain a little bit, but in the end, we're all going to have a country that we're happy with. And that's what the politicians are there for. I think young people believe that politics is possible of doing it. The older generations have probably seen a lot of people try and not do so well, or try and have done well for a little while and not. But so I have a lot of hope in the idea of the youth vote actually changing, and I'd love to get some more, I'd love it to be 16 and 17-year-olds being able to be involved, because I think it would change the way that we're doing it. We've had a long time of the same conversations. Let's switch it up and actually change the country.
Can I say,
Yes.
I agree with some of that. I don't agree with all of it. I think you can say this isn't a Labor or a Liberal Party issue, and that's true. But it is an ideological issue. Yeah. And the fact is that inequality and allowing inequality to grow and putting in place policies that increase inequality is a choice. It's a political choice that people make. And we have seen, why have we seen inequality increase over the last 30 to 40 years? It's because governments of all stripes around the world have pursued what Shiraji referred to as neoliberal economics, or otherwise known as supply-side or trickle-down economics. I'm not an economist either, actually, but I try and manage the lingo. John Kenneth Galbraith once described trickle-down economics as the theory that if you feed enough oats to a horse, some will pass through to feed the sparrows. And we've had that approach for a long time, and the idea that a rising tide lifts all boats. Well, tides don't rise from above, they rise from below. And so what we actually need to do is make clear political choices to lift the living standards of the lowest paid and of those on welfare support in this country. We can afford to do it. Per capita, we're the second wealthiest nation on earth after Switzerland. So it is an ideological issue. I agree that both sides of politics have failed to address this issue adequately over recent years. But I think actually we're seeing in the electorate now and in the massive support for the Raise the Rate campaign, a real shift across the board of people saying actually things have got out of whack. We've actually broken that social contract that underpinned Australian society for so long, that said if you work hard, if you look after yourself and your loved ones, you will get ahead, and if you fall on hard times, the state will be there to help you, the rest of society will be there to help you. Because we've seen an ideology creep in that says that's wrong, it is every man for himself, it is a dog-eat-dog world. And that is a very clear ideological split. I am heartened as well that I see young people moving back towards saying this is not working for us. But I think that we're seeing that throughout society at the moment, and the push you're absolutely right, the push has to come from us. But I think I am always direct about these issues. I think we do have to be quite clear that there are political ideologies and political choices at play, and we have to be very explicit about which choices we make to stop this getting worse.
Mm-hmm. Any other comments before we move to another question? No? Sorry? Here, yes.
My name is Joe Fernandez. I'm not in social science, so I'm speaking outside my field of expertise. But from what I remember, about 4 years ago, when Thomas Piketty wrote his book on capital, his proposed solution was a fairly small tax on capital. As far as I know, that idea has not gone anywhere, has not been adopted. And I just wanted your comments, telling me what's happened. And the other thing is, I believe I've heard that one of the Scandinavian countries is trying to experiment on a guaranteed minimum income. Wage, yeah. I also want to hear the panel's views on what's happening in those areas.
Terrific. So someone on a tax on capital and somebody else commenting on the minimum.
Peter. I can comment on the guaranteed minimum income. Finland's claims it's having an experiment in a guaranteed minimum income, but really it's actually introducing a welfare system that's a bit more like ours than the one they have. In the sense it's a sort of a non-contributory benefit system. So there's an enormous amount of talk about guaranteed minimum income around the world. So Switzerland had a vote on it last year. Various European cities are talking about pilots. Italy is talking about actually having a guaranteed minimum, what they call a guaranteed minimum income, but again, it's not actually really a universal basic income. My own view is that, and there's some work, I'll just give a plug for one of Peter's next publications. He's editing a book on 50 years since the Henderson Inquiry, and there's a very, very interesting chapter on the practicalities of a universal basic income in Australia, involving detailed modelling. I personally think that really the challenge and the reason why there's a lot of discussion about universal basic income is some of it's about the fear of robots, some of it's about the fear of the gig economy. I personally think that the idea that we're going to solve all of those problems through one type of social security benefit is the wrong way of thinking about it. That we have to have an integrated approach both to social security, but very importantly to the regulation of work. Because what the real challenge is organisations like Amazon and Uber and various other platforms that are basically trying to undercut people's employment protection. And so I think that this is not to say that the people who are in favour of universal basic income aren't genuinely aiming for something better, but I think that that looking at the management of the workforce and a better distribution of work and enforcement of fair working conditions is, in my view, where we should be concentrating on.
Terrific, thanks,
And
Peter. And
if I could add to that,
Yes.
one of the things that the debate about a universal basic income is also about is the fact that our social security system is so highly targeted, and it's also incredibly conditional. And one of the policy choices that has been made consistently over a few decades now is to increase the level of conditionality, which means the hoops that you have to jump through in order to, one, access social security and then sustain yourself on social security. And there's no good evidence that it produces better outcomes. All it does is create fear and insecurity. It also deeply stigmatises people on social security payments rather than understanding. And I think this was in the Hilda report today, that in fact the majority of people across their lives will have periods of dependence on the social security system. And if we understood that it is something that we share, we participate in, and we all benefit from, I think it would go some way to start mobilising an alternative discourse about the way that we want to structure our tax and transfer system, our social security system, to ensure common dignity for all, because we all participate and rely on it at different points in our lives. So, and I think often the debate about universal basic income, part of what sits behind that is a desire to reduce conditionality and to reduce stigmatisation, but I think there are alternative pathways.
And any comments on the Piketty's tax on capital? Peter? Yes.
Just a couple of things. First, on the Finnish basic income experiment, I heard Olli Kangas, who's the academic in charge of that, speak about it in June this year. And the government has pulled the plug on the experiment as of the end of this year. It was going to go for 4 years. They've scrapped it after 2 years. And his description of working with the government on trying to implement the experiment is quite staggering. I mean, he described it as the politicians he was working with as like children with a new toy. The basic income was the new toy, and for a couple of days they all wanted to play with it, and then another new toy came along and they just told him, get on, sort it out. And basically when he said, well, okay, I can sort it out, but I need some money to pay this basic income, sorry, no money. And so the experiment's really gone nowhere, very depressing. On the book, and this links the question to basic income, there is a chapter in this book written by Miranda Stewart and Ben Phillips and David Ingalls from the ANU, looking at how we might move from where we are now to a basic income scheme. And the sad story, in a way, is that any move within the current kind of structure makes lots and lots of people, many of them already low income, worse off. Because you take away the current benefits, and we can't afford to put in a basic income for everyone that's at the same level. So lots of poor people lose out. So they look in the paper at, well, how can we introduce new taxes to offset this? And one of the things they look at is a wealth tax, which comes back to this question. And if you introduce a modest 1 or 2% wealth tax, and don't forget, Australia is still, I think, the only OECD country that doesn't have a wealth tax or any form of capital gains tax or any major form of capital gains tax. If you do introduce a wealth tax, then options open up to try and have a basic income that does actually redistribute income towards the people who you want to benefit.
Thank you. Oh, Cassandra.
Oh, just to add on the in terms of the tax front, there's been a sort of a growing consensus about one of the big structural problems we've got is a heavy reliance on stamp duty, which is a real problem in terms of housing affordability, and not having a broad-based land tax, which of course is a form of tax on wealth. And we have to stay with this as hard as it is. There's a lot of consensus that would both be good socially, certainly good in terms of economic efficiency, but in terms of a secure, stable, identifiable tax base, it's you can't hide land to I don't think, unlike the gig economy, for example. And so we will have to grapple with the fact that we've got a very low coverage in terms of taxation on land at the moment, comparative to other countries.
Yeah, I was going to make a similar point, which is one of the sustained criticisms of Piketty, or at least one of the things that have helped capitalists sleep at night for the last 4 years, is that he lumped land and housing and real estate in with other forms of capital. And, classical economists would scoff at that. But, as Cassie just said, whilst the appropriate level of taxing other forms of capital you'll have debates about, you'll never see a debate about the appropriate level to tax land, and we're not actually doing that, and so we really could be pushing that much further.
So I think we have time for one more question, perhaps over there, at the back. Yep, coming.
Thanks, Eileen. It's Tony Wren from Anti-Poverty Week, and also Australian Network on Disability. It's really a question to Cass and Peter. Is there, in the subsequent reports, are you going to do any disaggregation by disability? Because I saw that you had sole parents households in there now, but we know that people with disability twice as likely to be living in poverty, and only 40% are in the labour market. And when we heard earlier about how important the labour market is, both for poverty and inequality, they're really highly overrepresented in that not working. So just a plea, really. Would be really fantastic if you did. Thanks.
That particular attribute is an important part of the disaggregation around the poverty analysis, and we will be doing that together with UNSW leading into October for Anti-Poverty Week. We will also, with our colleagues and research partners, be doing a debrief over this inequality analysis. So the partners, we're hoping to get together, I think, before the end of the calendar year to do a debrief about the way in which this research framework has been put out into the community, some of the gaps. We hear you on that. I think we'll certainly be very happy to discuss it, because I also think what we can see is there are many of us who are producing good work in this area, and we want to make the most of the collective research capability of the community and our partners. So we'll be having a look at where we've got some particularly acute areas. I think, for example, the fact that we haven't got a strong focus at the moment on people who are not born in Australia. That's not a part of the analysis at the moment. We also know that there are serious issues in terms of deprivation and lack of being excluded from Australian communities, and that's not coming through in the current work, but where will we take that? So thanks, Tony.
Thank you. I'll just ask Julie, and then the last word to Peter.
Sure, just a really quick plug. The Brotherhood of St Lawrence, on the basis of the HILDA data, produces a social exclusion monitor, and we'll be updating it in a few months actually, and it does speak directly to disability and the number of people with disability and chronic illness who fall into poverty and other forms of social exclusion. So that material is available, and anyway, so just if you want to have a look.
Fantastic. And Peter?
Yeah. I mean, one of the problems is that the income survey that we're using collects very poor information and often no information about disability status. And one of the things we've echoed, several people have echoed today, is we shouldn't take existing policies as fixed and given. Another is we shouldn't take existing data as fixed and given either. And one of the things I hope will come out of this partnership is putting a bit more pressure on the ABS, and it's not generally their fault because it's the government that funds them to do these things, so on the government. Isn't it ridiculous? Here we are talking in 2018 about what happened to income distribution 3 years ago, and we have to wait 18 months for the next survey. I mean, completely absurd. Every country that I know of has a state survey every year, sometimes more than once a year. So I think getting the kind of data more frequently and covering some of these cross-sectional issues is also a big gap at the moment.
Terrific, thank you. Thank you, Peter. So we've come to the end of the formal part. Thank you, everyone, for coming. Thank you especially to our panellists. Please thank them. And thank you to SPRC, Peter Saunders and the team, and Cassandra Goldie, ACOSS and the team, for producing the report. Make sure you get one, wherever they are, over there. And you might be lucky enough to catch somebody that you want to talk to over afternoon tea. So please stay and have afternoon tea. Thank you.
Are you going to